My hometown was littered with radioactive waste by the federal government as part of the Manhattan Project. I grew up 2 miles from the Lowell, Lake Ontario Ordnance Works site, and my dad grew up on 89th Street in Niagara Falls in the 40s. He says that he remembers sitting on the train tracks as a kid watching the Hooker chemical trucks bring in 55-gallon drums to the Love Canal. That whole area was contaminated with all sorts of nasty stuff. So what did they do? They bulldozed it over and built houses on it, of course. Then in the 70s, when people were noticing toxic sludge in their basements, kids' feet were being literally burned by the high levels of phosphorus in the ground, and people were getting sick, they acted like they knew nothing. Eventually people sued and the whole area was evacuated. They tried to clean it up, but they basically put tons of dirt and clay over the area as a cap, and it's all fenced off. You can see it when you drive east on the Niagara Falls Expressway to Towanda. For the Lewiston storage site, also known as the NFSS Niagara Falls Storage Site, I've read documents where they had hazardous storage barrels sitting exposed to the elements, with seepage and all that. Again, they've covered everything with clay to stop it, but it's already in the ground. The bad thing is that there's a large elementary and high school, Lewiston Porter, about 2 miles from the site, which is actually on property that used to be part of the site but was never used and was sold to the county. Needless to say, the cancer rate among long-term staff and teachers is higher than average. I'm glad to have finally moved away. In East Germany, a committed freedom fighter and her husband had dealt with having her home raided while she was away. Being arrested on the way to protests and all sorts of state-sponsored harassment. After the wall fell, she was able to read the documents the Stasi had kept on her and found out her own husband was an undercover agent and had written many reports on her activities with a bloodless banality. The CIA involvement in starting the Guatemalan Civil War, which lasted 36 years and led to the genocide of hundreds of thousands of indigenous people. And set up the country for the show that is Guatemala today. Just like Nicaragua, Guatemala is a beautiful country and the people are also beautiful, but, as one taxi driver said to me, 25 families own everything in the country. Corruption is rife and the destabilization caused by the involvement of the U.S. has been devastating for the country and its people. I watched from my hotel balcony as people came to the lake to bathe and wash their clothes. There's also funding the death squads in Nicaragua, and funding and training mass murderers in El Salvador, while artificially extending their civil war. This is why I hate when chuds are like they should stay in their country and fix their problems when a good chunk of the problems in Central and South America were directly caused by the U.S. There's also this. Most of the torture programs got their start by the CIA. As an aside, I hope Elliot Abrams chokes to death on his genital. He's a monster and the US government keeps hiring him. Project MKUltra. It's not totally unclassified yet, but it starts with a CIA scientist jumping out a window. After Watergate, this got knocked loose in the scuffle. It was revealed that the agent who had committed suicide was an unwilling participant in an LSD trial. The family met with the president for an apology, the only time until then or since that's happened, and instead of filing suit, the press convinced them to help push a law through Congress to stop the CIA. The CIA would later apologize, citing that the LSD trial was an attempt to create a mind control drug. That was the cover story for what they were actually doing. The CIA scientist had been exposed unwilling to an LSD trial before in an agency retreat, and had a profoundly negative reaction. The therapist he was sent to was actually an allergist who diagnosed him with all sorts of psychological issues. He sent a letter into the CIA of his retirement over the weight of what he'd done for them. Next day he was out a window. The CIA scientist was an agrologist, study of plants and pollen, and the lab he worked was found to have been making chemical weapons. All this points, subjective, that this whole thing was a cover for chemical weapons used in the Korean War. Jeffrey Dahmer's full confession, a couple of 100 pages of pure madness. Necrophilia, dismemberment, skinning, lobotomy, body part preservation, cannibalism. Dahmer became pretty close to his interrogating detectives, Dennis Murphy and Patrick Kennedy, and provided a lot of detail to them. A lot of it in a pretty candid, offhand manner. Dahmer should have been prosecuted for what he did in the army. For Capshaw, it began the day he and Dahmer, an army medic, were put into a room together. The assaults began at once and, eventually, he leapt from the third-floor window to escape. I had probably been roped 8 to 10 times, I don't know. He was tying me to the bunk with motor pool rope. He took all my clothing from me. He would either beat me before he raped me or he would beat me after. Project Sunshine, where the US government bought remains of dead infants, to test for radiation. When they took limbs from them, the parents were never told. One mother wasn't allowed to dress her daughter for her funeral, because doctors had removed her legs, and didn't want her to find out. The Department of Health and Human Services practiced female sterilization on Native American women all the way through the 1970s. This was so prevalent that between 25 to 50% of Native women were sterilized against their will, and their birth rate dropped by 3/4 following this time. Black and poor women too. I remember reading a story about a 12-year-old black girl in the South in the 60s going to the doctor for an appendectomy and leaving sterilized without being told. Many didn't find out for years, until they realized they should have gotten their period by now or were having trouble conceiving. Kinda sobering knowing that we were using tax dollars to suppress indigenous birth rates less than 50 years ago. Operation Northwoods, a plan for a false flag operation that came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Department of Defense in 1962 and given to JFK, who turned it down. The plan called for the CIA to commit terrorist actions against U.S. civilians across the United States and frame Cuba, allowing us the right to invade and depose Castro and the communist government there. It was declassified and can be found online at the JFK Library. Terrifying that no one knows or seems to care that this was suggested by our government to the president. When the Space Shuttle Challenger was destroyed, it was reported that all 7 astronauts were killed instantly. It was revealed decades later that some, if not all of the astronauts survived the initial explosion, as the cockpit cabin had enough protection to not be breached. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, they were awake and aware, as they plummeted toward the Atlantic Ocean. Understandably, NASA knew that the news of their terrifying death would have crippled the space program even more than it already was. As a part of the Army and CIA's experiments into mind control, they put electrodes into the pleasure centers of dogs' brains. Initially, they wanted hundreds of dogs. They only actually got 10, and of those only a few were implanted. The ones which were would be remote controlled by zapping them and essentially giving them a dose of dopamine when they were facing the right direction. The controllers would stop the dope zap when they wanted the dogs to stop, and then the dogs would reorient themselves until they were facing the correct direction. This meant when the controllers weren't present, the dogs who had been implanted would continually spin in circles, even in their cages, always looking for the direction that gave them that next hit. The program ran out of funding in the mid-60s, and the dogs were destroyed. If you want to read all about it and other things that the US and governments around the world are up to from the horse's mouth, I highly recommend the website theblackvault.com. New Zealand's UFO files are a bit creepy. I was in the library and stumbled across the bound files. There's a lot of assumed crazy people being crazy, but there's also one specific one that stood out from respectable Air Force pilots who were both in the air, conducted mini-tests, for example blinking, moving the plane in relation to the object, verifying what he saw with the co-pilot to ensure it wasn't an illusion or his mind. I don't know, just the fact that you'd assume he wasn't crazy creeps me out so much. Devil Eyes. The plan after 9/11 to make figurines that look like Osama bin Laden and give them to kids in South Asia. After it's left in the sun for a certain amount of time, its face would peel off to reveal a demon-like visage with red skin, green eyes, and black markings, basically a demon. The objective was to scare kids and their parents so bin Laden and Al-Qaeda would lose support. There was an episode of Radiolab that talks about an enormous secret facility in Britain that houses the British Empire's secret archives. The way they describe it, it sounds like the place where the Ark of the Covenant is stored at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. What they uncover in the episode is the human rights atrocities that were committed by British troops during the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya during the 1950s. There were details in the uncovered documents about detention camps and torture that occurred during the conflict. It gave grounds for surviving Mau Mau to seek compensation against the Crown in recent years. The atrocities of the conflict were not widely known about until recently. Project Thor, using a satellite bomber to bomb a city. Imagine, a missile or a bomb coming from space, and before you know it, your city is destroyed by a falling missile or bomb. Kinetic bombardment isn't even that expensive. It doesn't require orbital height, as the tungsten rods, chosen as their density and heat resistance allows them to gather phenomenal kinetic energy without falling apart, reach terminal velocity fairly quickly. For a fraction of the cost of an invasion, you could launch some low-orbit flights, drop some metal rods onto the area and completely obliterate huge swaths of the landscape. But say you do invest in proper orbits, you get a couple dozen satellites, load each one up with a few dozen large tungsten rods and leave them in orbit. Then, Next time you want to strike the fear of God into a country, you just drop them over the course of a 15-minute tea break and atomize the east coast of a country. Oh, and the other satellites are on standby until they orbit into position. Not really terrifying but messed up, Operation Paperclip. Where after World War II the US government took Nazi scientists and shipped them to America to do science. Some of them came straight from Nuremberg cells. The most noteworthy being Wernher von Braun. Von Braun built the V-2 rockets with Jewish slave labor. Every day they would execute the 5 slowest workers in front of the other workers to incentive them to work harder. Once he came to America, we shipped him to Huntsville, Alabama, where he built the Saturn V, the rocket used in the Apollo program, and got us to the moon. When they performed a lobotomy on Rosemary Kennedy, due to her being intellectually disabled. At 23 years of age her father arranged a prefrontal lobotomy. At the time the procedure had only been done about 100 times in US. It failed, leaving her unable to speak intelligibly and incapacitated. She was conscious during the operation. They say that the neurosurgeons asked the patient to count from 10 to 0, to know when they should stop cutting down. They stopped when her speech was incoherent. Saddest thing is that she had to endure it for 64 years. All because her family couldn't risk any political embarrassment. This is a rabbit hole of a case, only partially classified by the CIA until information was released 3 years after initial capture. Robert Levinson, former FBI agent, retired and began working as a private investigator, specializing in Russian crime circles. Levinson traveled to the Persian Gulf's Kish Island, which had fewer restrictions on American passports due to being a free trade zone, to enter Iran. He was last seen March 9, 2007. For 3 years after his disappearance, the U.S. government was adamant that he was not acting with a government party, only private eye work. After 3 years, it was confirmed that Levinson was acting as part of the CIA on an unauthorized mission to gather data on an Iranian regime. He has had a proof of life appearance in 2010. Levinson has 7 kids, one of which with his mom, that have traveled to Iran find their dad and husband, only to be shown plain manifestos by Iranian officials, suggesting that Levinson had left. As of 2013, if he's still alive, Levinson is the longest held American captive at 12 years.